Chapter 1. The Haunting Begins. Ed and Lorraine Warren had seen their fair share of supernatural cases. Demonic possessions, restless spirits, poltergeists. They'd faced them all, but nothing had prepared them for what awaited them at the Perron family farmhouse. The moment they stepped out of their car, the air felt different, heavy, oppressive, and thick with an unmistakable sense of dread. The farmhouse, tucked away in the quiet rural countryside, stood looming against the gray sky, its weathered wood and sagging roof a reflection of its dark past. The parents had called for help after weeks of increasingly bizarre and terrifying occurrences. Furniture overturned in the dead of night, strange whispers, cold spots, and the unmistakable sensation that something, or someone, was always lurking just beyond the corner of their eye. But these were only the surface signs of the evil that had rooted itself deep within the house. Roger Perron, a sturdy man in his 40s with a calm demeanor, led the Warrens inside. He didn't speak much, his face drawn and tired, his eyes dark with worry. Lorraine, ever attuned to the unseen world, seemed almost instantly to feel the pulse of the house. Her fingers tingled, and she could already hear faint voices, disembodied and distant, murmuring from within the walls. As they entered the foyer, Lorraine paused. The house seemed to sigh under the weight of its own history. There was something about the air, thick and stifling, that made it hard to breathe, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the hairs on the back of Lorraine's neck stood on end. Roger led them into the living room, where his wife Carolyn and their 5 daughters sat huddled on the couch. Their faces were pale, exhausted from sleepless nights, their eyes wide and hollow from the terror they had lived with. Carolyn Perron, a woman in her 30s with gentle features and a maternal presence, stood as the Warrens entered. She smiled weakly, trying to mask the fear behind her eyes, but it was evident in the way her hands trembled as she clasped them in front of her. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice tight with emotion. Ed offered a reassuring smile, though his own heart quickened as he scanned the room. There was something in the air, an unseen presence, something malevolent that lingered like a shadow in the corners of the room. Ed was a practical man, known for his skeptical nature, but even he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong in this house. "We're here to help," he said, his voice steady, though the doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. "Tell us what's been happening." Carolyn took a deep breath, sitting down next to her daughters. Her youngest, April, clung to her mother, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at the floor. The older girls, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, and Cindy, were all there too, their faces showing varying degrees of fear and exhaustion. It was clear that this was not the same household that had moved into this house just a few months ago. At first, Carolyn spoke of the small, strange occurrences, lights flickering, objects inexplicably moving, and odd noises echoing through the house during the night. But as she continued, the fear in her voice grew deeper. She told them about the nights when her children were tossed from their beds by an invisible force, or the times they would wake up screaming to see shadows moving in the corners of their rooms. The haunting, she said, was getting worse every day. "We thought it was just our imagination," Carolyn said, her voice faltering. "But it's not. It's real. Something is here with us." Lorraine closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. She could feel it now, the weight of something ancient, a darkness that seemed to pulse through the walls of the house like a living thing. It was a malevolent presence, feeding off the fear and torment that had infected the family. And it wasn't going to leave until it had taken everything from them. Ed, more pragmatic than his wife, nodded and motioned for his team to begin setting up their equipment. "We'll need to investigate the whole house. It's important to find where the activity is coming from. We'll start with the basement." Roger led them down into the dimly lit basement, and as they descended the creaky stairs, Lorraine couldn't shake the sense that they were descending into the very heart of the darkness. The air grew colder, and she felt a sharp pain in her chest, like something was pressing against her ribs, squeezing the breath from her lungs. Ed paused at the bottom of the stairs, feeling the same ominous presence. They moved into the basement, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The concrete floor was cracked, the air thick with the scent of mildew and age. In one corner, a few boxes were stacked haphazardly, some old furniture tucked away out of sight. But what struck Lorraine the most was the oppressive silence, the absolute stillness of the space. There was no movement, no sound from the outside world. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, Lorraine stopped in her tracks. She had felt something, an overwhelming surge of energy, a pull deep within her chest, like an invisible force tugging at her very soul. She glanced around, her heart pounding, but there was nothing visible. No shadow, no figure. It was then that she saw it, faint but unmistakable. Carved into the stone wall of the basement was an old symbol, an occult mark of some kind, its edges worn and chipped from years of neglect. Lorraine's stomach lurched. She had seen this symbol before in her work, an ancient marking used in rituals meant to bind demons to a particular place. "This is bad," she murmured under her breath. "Very bad." Ed stepped closer, his eyes scanning the wall. He'd seen his share of occult symbols in his line of work, but this one was different. It was not just a marking, it was a seal, a barrier of sorts, something that held whatever evil resided in the house in place, a warning to anyone who dared come near. "We need to keep moving," Ed said, his voice low but steady. Lorraine hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on the symbol. It seemed to call to her, to beckon her closer. But she knew better. She had learned through the years that these things were not to be trifled with. The deeper they went into the house, the stronger the pull became, until it felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. The investigation continued throughout the night. Ed set up his equipment, trying to capture any audio or visual evidence, while Lorraine worked in tandem with him, her senses attuned to the spiritual presence in the house. It didn't take long before the activity escalated. In the upstairs bedrooms, strange cold spots appeared. The air grew frigid, frost forming on the window panes despite the heat of the summer night. The children were increasingly unable to sleep, tossing and turning, mumbling in their sleep as they were drawn into restless, fitful dreams. April, the youngest, had been whispering things that made no sense. Her eyes were wide with terror, her gaze constantly darting to the dark corners of the room. "I don't want to go to sleep," April whispered to her mother one evening, her small hands gripping Carolyn's arm. "It's not safe." Carolyn kissed her forehead, brushing her hair away. "There's nothing to be afraid of, sweetheart. It's just the house playing tricks on you." But deep down, Carolyn knew it wasn't the house. It was something far worse, and it was only a matter of time before it showed its true face. That night, the activity intensified. The house creaked and groaned as if it were alive. Furniture shifted on its own, sliding across the floor with a low, groaning sound. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways, though no one was there. And in the dead of night, they heard the soft crying of a child, distant and broken, coming from the attic. Ed and Lorraine knew they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. They had only scratched the surface. What they had initially thought to be a standard haunting was now proving to be something much darker. A malevolent force that was feeding off the fear and despair of the Perron family. But there was more. Something far worse was waiting in the shadows of that farmhouse, something that had been waiting for years, and now it had chosen to reveal itself. As Lorraine stood in the darkness of the house, her pulse quickened. She was beginning to understand the terrible truth. Whatever this was, it was ancient, powerful, and it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. Chapter 2. A Hidden Evil. The next morning came as a grim relief, but it was a false sense of comfort that seemed to quickly dissipate. The light streaming through the windows was weak, filtering through the trees outside, as if reluctant to touch the darkness that hung in the house like a thick fog. It was an early autumn day, the kind where the sun barely pierced through the lingering clouds, and the cool breeze only made the house feel colder. Inside, the air was stifling. The Perron family had tried to go about their day as best as they could, trying to act normal for the sake of the children, but the terror that had gripped them the night before was far from over. The house had not let up. It never did. It only seemed to grow stronger. Carolyn stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she wiped down the counter. She tried to keep herself busy, but there was no escaping the unease that seemed to hang in the air. Her thoughts kept returning to the cold spots that had plagued her throughout the night, to the whispering voices that had echoed through the walls. She had hoped it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but it wasn't. It was real. It was as real as the knot that twisted tighter in her stomach every time she heard a creak or a groan from the house. Her daughters were upstairs, quiet for once. She could hear their soft voices through the floorboards, but even that didn't provide comfort. Instead, it made her feel more isolated. The house seemed to separate them, as if the space between the floors was a chasm they couldn't cross, a space where the evil that had settled in the farmhouse could hide, watching them all. Ed and Lorraine were already downstairs in the basement, preparing to set up more equipment. Lorraine was pacing, her mind racing with everything she had sensed the night before. She had touched the walls of the house, felt the pulse of the place, the power it had over its inhabitants. And yet, the more she tried to understand it, the more elusive it became. The evil here wasn't just haunting the house. It was embedded in its very foundation, its essence entwined with the land itself. It was as if the house had been built as a conduit for something far older, far darker, something beyond their comprehension. Ed, ever the skeptic, had tried to remain calm. But as he set up the cameras and audio equipment, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut that something was amiss. He'd seen many cases before, but there was something different about this one. It was as if the house wasn't just a location. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was feeding off the family's fear. Lorraine's voice broke through his thoughts as she stepped up beside him. "This place isn't just haunted," she said, her tone low and unsettling. "It's a prison. And the demon inside, it's not just tormenting them. It's binding them here, keeping them trapped. And it's using them." Ed turned slowly, looking at her with furrowed brows. "A prison? You're saying it's not just the house that's cursed? It's the land?" Lorraine nodded, her face pale as she looked toward the house above them. "There's something about this place. The land has been drenched in blood. I don't know how long it's been here, but this evil, it's been waiting. And it's not just Bathsheba. There's more to this story than we realize. Bathsheba is only the beginning." Ed's stomach tightened. He had heard of Bathsheba Sherman, the witch who had once lived in the farmhouse, the woman believed to have sacrificed her child to the devil in exchange for immortality. But he never imagined the evil would be this pervasive, this all-encompassing. Lorraine's gaze was distant, her thoughts seemingly far away. "It's all connected," she whispered. "Bathsheba's death wasn't the end of the evil. It's still here. It's been waiting for someone to come, someone who could free it from this prison." A chill ran through Ed. He knew they had to be careful. The danger wasn't just in the house. It was everywhere. And if they weren't careful, if they didn't stop the entity here and now, it could escape, spreading its influence far beyond the farmhouse. There was no telling what it could do if it was unleashed. "Let's get back to the family," Ed said, his voice steady, though inside he was wrestling with the growing sense of dread. "We need to keep them safe. Whatever's happening here, it's only going to get worse." They gathered their things and made their way back upstairs, where Roger and Carolyn were waiting in the living room, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. The Warrens could see the exhaustion in their faces, the weight of sleepless nights bearing down on them. But there was also something else there, a glimmer of uncertainty, as if they too had begun to understand that this was no ordinary haunting. "Any changes?" Ed asked as he sat down opposite Roger. Carolyn shook her head, her expression strained. "It's the same. Worse, actually. The kids, they're not sleeping. They keep hearing things, voices, whispers. April won't even go near the attic. She says it's calling her." Ed and Lorraine exchanged a glance. They had already suspected that the entity was targeting the children, but hearing it confirmed was another thing entirely. "Have you noticed anything different?" Lorraine asked, her voice soft, as though she were speaking to Carolyn but also to herself, trying to piece together the puzzle. "Anything unusual with the house itself?" Carolyn hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. "The creaks. The house, it feels alive. It's like the walls are closing in on us." Lorraine nodded. "That's what we're feeling too. The house is feeding off the fear, but it's more than that. There's something buried here, something older than the house itself. It's as though this place has always been a sanctuary for evil." Roger's face darkened. "I knew something was wrong when we moved in. I just didn't know how bad it was." Lorraine looked toward the stairs again. "There's something in the attic, something that's been left there. The spirits here, they're not just trapped, they're being manipulated." Ed stood up. "We need to go up there. We need to confront whatever is hiding in that attic." Carolyn stood as well, though she was reluctant. "Please be careful. I don't want anyone else to get hurt." "We will," Ed assured her, his voice firm. "We've faced worse than this." Lorraine gave Carolyn a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. She could feel it now, that oppressive pull. The house wasn't just holding the spirits of the past. It was trying to hold them too. Ed and Lorraine made their way up the stairs to the attic, the air growing heavier with each step. As they approached the door, Lorraine's heart began to race. She felt a deep, instinctive pull to the attic, as though something was waiting for them. The house had been trying to protect the darkness hidden there, and now it was drawing them closer. With a deep breath, Ed opened the door to the attic. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the faint glow of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust hung thick in the air, the wooden floorboards creaking underfoot as they stepped inside. And then they saw it. In the far corner of the room, just behind an old, worn trunk, lay a symbol. It was etched into the floorboards, the same symbol Lorraine had seen in the basement. It was unmistakable. The very same occult marking, worn with age, yet still burning with dark energy. Lorraine felt her heart drop into her stomach. "It's here," she whispered. "It's been waiting." Ed turned to her, his face pale. "We need to get out of here. Now." But it was too late. A low growl rumbled from the corner of the attic, and the temperature in the room dropped to freezing. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, coiling in on themselves like something alive. And from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was not human, not fully. Its form was distorted, a grotesque creature born from the shadows, its eyes burning like molten embers. The air hummed with power, a terrible force that threatened to consume everything in its path. It had been waiting, and now it was free. Chapter 3. The Awakening. The darkness that had lingered in the house now seemed to have a life of its own. After discovering the ominous symbol in the attic, Lorraine and Ed Warren knew they had just scratched the surface of a much deeper, more ancient evil that had long awaited its moment to strike. The air inside the house grew suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in around them, each breath becoming more difficult to take. Ed stood by the attic door, his hand gripping the old wood of the frame as if he were holding onto some shred of reality. His heart was racing, and the growl that had rumbled from the darkness was still echoing in his mind. He turned to Lorraine, his face pale, his eyes filled with concern. "This is worse than we thought," he muttered, voice tight. "That thing in the attic, it's not just a spirit. It's something older, something darker." Lorraine, her face drawn in concentration, nodded slowly. She had felt it too, the malevolent energy that had pulsed from the shadows. But it wasn't just the creature in the attic that terrified her. It was the overwhelming sense that it had been released on purpose. Someone had summoned it. Someone had freed it. "We need to find out who," Lorraine replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And why it's here." But as they descended the stairs back to the main floor, the oppressive energy seemed to follow them, clinging to their skin like a cold sweat. The house was alive with a strange hum, an almost mechanical rhythm that matched the pounding of their own hearts. Every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet seemed too loud, too unnatural. Roger and Carolyn were waiting for them in the living room, their expressions a mixture of worry and fear. The children had retreated to the far corners of the house, hiding behind locked doors. No one wanted to be anywhere near the attic. No one wanted to be anywhere near the house itself. "We have to leave," Roger said, his voice urgent. "This place it's not safe. I can feel it, too. It's like the house is pulling us in, trapping us here." Carolyn, pale and shaking, stood beside him, clutching her youngest daughter, April, who was clinging to her side. "Please, you have to help us. This thing, it's after our children. It's not just haunting us. It's trying to take them." Ed and Lorraine exchanged a glance, and Lorraine felt a sickening chill crawl up her spine. They had hoped to contain the evil, to banish it, but it was clear now that the malevolent presence wasn't something they could simply exorcise. It was a force of nature, an ancient darkness that had been awakened, and it was feeding on the fear and vulnerability of the family. "We need to get to the heart of it," Ed said, his voice grim. "Whatever is holding it here, whatever is keeping it anchored to this place, we need to find it. Where do we start?" Carolyn asked, her voice barely audible, like she was afraid to speak the words aloud. Lorraine's eyes drifted to the windows, her senses tingling with a strange sensation. It was as if the house was listening to their every word, as if the very air around them was growing thicker, more oppressive. She felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest, and she winced. "Lorraine," Ed asked, his voice filled with concern as he stepped closer. "What is it? What's wrong?" Lorraine shook her head, trying to shake off the vision that had just gripped her. For a moment, she had seen something, a flash, a glimpse of the past. It was dark and chaotic, a swirling mass of shadows and fire. She saw a woman, her face twisted in agony, a baby held tightly in her arms. And then there was the symbol, the same symbol they had found in the attic. But in this vision, it was blood-red, glowing, pulsating with power. "I don't know," Lorraine whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw something. A woman, a child. The symbol. It's tied to this place, to the land itself. It's not just the house. This evil was created here. Long before we came." Ed reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the moment. "Whatever it is, we need to stop it. If it's feeding off them, we can't let it take anyone else." They didn't waste another moment. The Warrens began their search through the house, combing every room, looking for anything that could shed light on the source of the evil. The house was eerily quiet now, the usual creaks and groans replaced by an oppressive silence. It was as if the house itself had grown still, waiting for something to happen. Ed's flashlight swept across the walls as he scanned the house. "It has to be somewhere, something hidden," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His eyes lingered on the family portraits that lined the hallway, their glassy eyes staring back at him, their smiles frozen in time. Each picture seemed to distort as he passed, as if the figures within them were subtly shifting, their expressions darkening. He hurried past them, unease gnawing at him. Lorraine walked beside him, her hand brushing against the wall. She could feel the vibrations of the house in her fingertips. There was something alive here, something that was watching them, studying them, waiting for them to uncover its secret. They continued their search, moving from room to room, until they finally came across a narrow door hidden beneath a staircase. It was barely noticeable, tucked away behind a heavy curtain. But Lorraine knew immediately that this was it. The source, the heart of the evil. She could feel the pull, the magnetism of it drawing her in. "This is it," Lorraine said, her voice low. "Whatever is in here, it's what's been keeping it all bound." Ed didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open, revealing a small, cramped space beneath the stairs. Inside, the room was dark, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. On the far wall was a large, ornate mirror, its frame intricately carved, its glass strangely reflective, as though it were more than just a simple mirror. But it wasn't the mirror that caught Ed's attention. It was the ritual circle, painted in red, stretching across the floor. The symbol they had seen in the attic was etched into the floorboards, repeated in 1,000 tiny details throughout the room. This was where it had all begun, the ritual, the summoning. Lorraine stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. This is where it started. This is where the evil was born. Ed's gaze was fixed on the mirror. He could feel its pull, the way it seemed to beckon them closer. It wasn't just a mirror, it was a gateway, a portal to something darker, something far worse than anything they had ever encountered. "The mirror," Lorraine said, her voice strained. "It's not just a reflection. It's a doorway. It's how the evil came through." Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. Lorraine's breath came out in sharp clouds of mist, and Ed's hand instinctively went to his chest as a sharp, searing pain stabbed through him. Something was happening, something was breaking free. The room began to shake, the walls groaning as though they were alive. And then, in the reflection of the mirror, they saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight across its bones. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. It was a figure from the past, from a time long gone. And yet, it was not gone at all. It was here. It was real. The entity stepped forward, and with it, the air seemed to ripple. Time itself seemed to bend as the reflection in the mirror twisted and shifted, becoming a living nightmare. Lorraine staggered back, gasping for breath. "It's coming, it's real." Ed didn't hesitate. "We need to destroy it. Now." But the moment they moved toward the mirror, the creature in the reflection grinned wider, its eyes gleaming with malice. It wasn't just a shadow, a memory. It was alive. And it was hungry. As the mirror pulsed with an unearthly energy, the room began to twist, the darkness closing in on them, trapping them in a web of fear and chaos. The Warrens knew this was just the beginning. The entity had been unleashed, and there was no telling what horrors it would bring. But they weren't backing down. They couldn't. The fight for the Perron family's lives had just begun, and the house, the land, the evil. It would stop at nothing to claim them all. Chapter 4. The Curse Unleashed. The night had descended over the farmhouse, and with it came an unnatural quiet. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows, but inside the house, nothing moved. The house, for all its creaks and groans, seemed to be holding its breath. Inside, the Warrens sat in the dim glow of their flashlights, the cold of the room creeping into their bones. They had seen horrors before, but nothing like this. The power in this place was ancient, deeply rooted in the land itself, and it was impossible to ignore its pull. Ed and Lorraine sat across from each other, their thoughts heavy. The mirror, the symbol, the ritual circle, they had only scratched the surface, but it was clear that they were dealing with something far worse than they had anticipated. The spirit that had been summoned here wasn't just malevolent. It was intelligent, cunning, and had been biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Its power wasn't just in the physical world, but in the very fabric of reality. It could reach into the deepest parts of the mind, manipulate the darkest fears, and bend the will of anyone foolish enough to stand in its way. "We need to find out everything we can about this ritual," Ed said, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might somehow invite the evil closer. "We have to know who did it, why they did it, and how to stop it. This is no ordinary haunting. This is a curse." Lorraine nodded, her face pale. She had seen things in the mirror, terrifying glimpses of the past, flashes of twisted, tortured souls. But she knew the worst was yet to come. "I can feel it," she whispered. "It's tied to this place, to this land. But whoever did this, whoever opened the door, there's more to their story. This isn't just some random act of evil. It's personal." A faint noise came from upstairs. It was soft at first, a dragging sound, as if something, or someone, was slowly making its way down the hall. Ed's hand instinctively went to the back of his chair, his eyes narrowing as the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something or someone alive. "It's happening again," Ed muttered. "The entity is making its move." Lorraine's eyes shifted to the staircase, her heart racing. The air in the room had changed. The temperature had dropped again, and this time, the cold was biting, like a blade pressing against their skin. She stood abruptly, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. There was something in the house, something they hadn't fully understood. And now it was drawing closer. Without speaking, Ed and Lorraine moved toward the staircase, their footsteps silent, cautious. The house seemed to breathe with them, each movement amplified by the eerie stillness that had settled over it. The darkness upstairs was thick, swallowing the light from their flashlights, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally as they reached the top of the stairs. At the end of the hall stood the door to the room where the ritual had taken place. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting them in, beckoning them closer. But the doorframe seemed wrong. The shadows there were darker than they should have been. The doorway was no longer just an opening into another room. It felt like a threshold, a boundary between two worlds. Ed's hand hovered over the door handle, but Lorraine stepped forward first, pushing the door open with a single, fluid motion. The room inside was as they had left it, desolate and cold. But there was a difference now. The symbols on the floor had shifted. The blood-red paint had darkened, as if absorbing the life force of the house itself, spreading in new directions, creating a sprawling network of veins across the wooden floor. Something was feeding off the house, off the fear, the sorrow, the energy of the family that had lived there for years. It had taken root here, and now it was spreading, infecting everything it touched. Lorraine bent down, her fingers hovering over the symbols. She could feel them, pulsing beneath her fingertips like a living, breathing thing. There was a sickening, electric energy flowing through the ground, and the deeper she pressed, the more the energy seemed to try to pull her in. "We have to destroy this," Ed said, his voice tight with determination. "If we don't, it will keep spreading." Lorraine nodded, but as she straightened, she froze. Her gaze shifted to the mirror again. This time, there was no reflection of them standing there. Instead, the surface of the mirror had become a window, a portal to something else. The shadows on the other side were moving, writhing, twisting like smoke. But there was something else there, something that moved with purpose. A face. It was pale, contorted in agony, and for a split second, Lorraine felt a deep, visceral pain in her chest, as though it were her own suffering being reflected back at her. She gasped, pulling her hand back from the mirror, her heart racing. "Lorraine!" Ed's voice was concerned now, but she couldn't respond. Her mind was overwhelmed by the vision she had seen. The face in the mirror, it was one of the spirits trapped in this cursed place, a victim of the ritual, a soul that had been twisted and distorted over time. "That's it," Lorraine whispered, her voice barely audible. "The mirror, it's not just a portal. It's a prison. The souls trapped in it are feeding the evil, making it stronger." Ed's face hardened. "We have to shut it down before it's too late." But even as he spoke, they could both feel the temperature plummeting, the air growing thick with the stench of decay. The room was no longer just a room. It was alive. The very walls seemed to pulse, the symbols on the floor glowing faintly in the dark, like veins in a corpse. The shadows in the mirror began to stir again, and this time, they moved toward the door. It wasn't just a spirit. It was something worse, something that had been unleashed and was now hunting. The darkness was no longer content with merely watching. It was coming for them. Ed and Lorraine backed away slowly, but the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, trapping them inside the room. Panic rose in their throats as the walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The mirror shimmered again, but this time, the face was no longer alone. There were more of them, dozens, hundreds, figures reaching out from the mirror, their hands pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. And then, with a deafening roar, the mirror cracked. Lorraine screamed, but it was too late. The walls trembled, and the air itself seemed to distort as the dark entities began to pour through the shattered mirror. The room was filled with an oppressive, suffocating weight, as though the very atmosphere had become a prison, trapping them in its grip. "Ed! Lorraine!" A voice called out from the other side of the door. It was Roger, frantic, his voice breaking through the chaos. "Get out of there! Get out now!" But before they could respond, the shadows closed in. The last thing Lorraine saw was the glint of eyes, dark, cold eyes, staring back at her. Chapter 5. Into the Abyss. The house was no longer simply a home. It was a prison, a malignant, living thing with an insatiable hunger. The walls seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, the darkness pressing in from all sides, a force that no one could fight, no one could resist. The cracks in the mirror had been the beginning of the end, and now the shadows had entered the real world, bringing with them an overwhelming, suffocating weight. The evil that had been trapped in this place for so long was no longer content to remain in the dark. It had been unleashed, and now it wanted blood. Ed and Lorraine Warren had faced darkness before. They had confronted demons, ghosts, and every manner of unholy force imaginable, but nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had ever felt this alive, this driven. There was something ancient in the air, a presence that reached into their souls, probing, searching, knowing them, feeding off their fear. The door to the cursed room slammed shut behind them with a deafening force. It was as though the house itself had taken a breath and exhaled, trapping them inside with the very thing they were trying to stop. The temperature dropped instantly, the air growing thick with the stench of decay. The mirror had shattered, but the thing within had not gone. It was here now, somewhere in the house, and it would not stop until it had consumed them all. Lorraine stumbled backward, her hand pressed against her chest as though she could hold in the panic that was rising in her throat. "It's here," she whispered, her voice shaking with the weight of the words. She had seen those eyes in the mirror, the cold, empty gaze that bore into her very soul. It wasn't a ghost, not a spirit. It was something far darker, far more dangerous. Ed grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the shattered mirror. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight with urgency. The air felt heavier now, the pressure building with every passing second. He could feel it. Something was hunting them, something that was waiting to strike. They couldn't outrun it, but they had to try. The house groaned as if in agreement, the creaking of the floorboards echoing in the otherwise silent hallways. Lorraine looked down at her hands, trembling, but it wasn't just fear that made her shake. It was the pull of the house, the way the very ground seemed to want to swallow them whole. She had never felt anything like this before. It wasn't just malevolent, it was a force of nature, older than time itself, and it was intent on their destruction. "Come on," Ed urged, guiding her toward the stairs. The children were still somewhere in the house, and they had to get to them before it was too late. The family needed to leave. They all needed to get out before they were consumed by the same evil that had already started to tear apart the fabric of the house. But as they reached the stairs, the world seemed to tilt. The ground beneath them shuddered, the walls around them buckling as though the house itself was alive. A low rumble reverberated through the floor, and then a sound, horrible, guttural, as though something ancient had just awoken from a long slumber. "It's coming," Lorraine gasped, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "It's close." Ed turned, his eyes scanning the hallway, his body tense, ready to fight, ready to defend them both. "We need to move faster," he said, and they began to climb the stairs, every step taken with dread, knowing that they couldn't outrun what was coming. The upstairs was eerily silent. The hallway stretched before them, the dark shadows clinging to the walls like thick, suffocating blankets. The rooms beyond were all sealed tight, locked doors, barricades of furniture, the sound of breathless whispers from behind them. It was as if the house had swallowed everyone whole, leaving only a hollow, empty shell behind. Ed's eyes locked onto the door at the end of the hall, the door to the family's bedroom. He could feel it. The thing, whatever it was inside that room. It was waiting for them. He pushed the door open with a swift motion, the creaking sound of the old wood echoing in the stillness. Inside, the room was cold, colder than it should have been. The temperature had dropped even further, and the air felt thick, as though it were filled with something heavy. The bed was untouched, the covers smooth, but the room was unnaturally still. And then they heard it, the sound of a soft whispering. Lorraine's eyes darted around the room, her senses on edge. The whispering wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It wasn't coming from anywhere outside the room. It was coming from within the shadows themselves. "Ed, look," Lorraine whispered, her voice trembling as she pointed to the corner of the room. Ed followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing but the dense darkness gathering there. But then, slowly, something began to shift. The shadows seemed to gather in one place, swirling as though they were alive, forming into a shape, a figure. The figure was tall, gaunt, and misshapen. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, pale and cracked, and its eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural, sickly light. It was the same figure that had appeared in the mirror, a twisted, contorted thing, but now it was no longer trapped. It was here, in the room, and it was coming toward them. Lorraine took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for Ed's. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides, like a vice around her chest. The entity moved closer, its eyes locked on her, its twisted smile growing wider. She could see the malice in its gaze, the hunger. And she knew in that instant that it wasn't just a ghost or a demon. It was something far older, far more terrifying. "Get out of the room," Ed shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "Now!" But before they could move, the figure lunged, a sharp, bone-crushing scream filling the room as it rushed toward them, its hands outstretched, claws extended. The air grew thick with an overwhelming pressure, and everything around them seemed to close in, as if they were being suffocated by the very house itself. The creature's claws scraped the floor, its footsteps slow and deliberate as it advanced toward them. Every instinct in Lorraine screamed for them to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The door was shut, the house was a maze, and they were trapped. With no other option, Ed raised the cross, the symbol of their faith and their only defense against the dark force before them. The creature hissed, recoiling at the sight of the cross, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it let out a guttural growl, one that rattled their bones. "This thing isn't just haunting us," Ed said, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "It's here because of something deeper. It's feeding on the darkness, on the pain. It's not going to leave until it has claimed us all." Lorraine's heart hammered in her chest as she clutched Ed's arm, her mind racing. She felt a strange pull toward the shadows, an invisible tether connecting her to the entity, and for a moment, she felt herself drifting, her vision clouding. But she shook her head, clearing the fog in her mind. She had to focus. She turned to Ed, her voice filled with resolve. "We need to find the source, the thing that called it here." Before Ed could answer, the creature lunged again, its twisted mouth opening wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. But just as quickly, the figure was struck by a surge of light. The cross glowed brightly, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to shift, as though time itself had slowed. The creature screamed in agony, its form flickering and distorting, but it didn't disappear. It was still there, still hungry, still coming for them. "We need to end this," Lorraine said, her voice firm, a glimmer of hope cutting through the fear. "Together. Now." Ed and Lorraine stood their ground, the light from the cross casting long shadows across the room. The creature writhed, the glow searing its pallid skin, but it only seemed to grow more enraged. It let out a piercing shriek that shook the walls, vibrating through the floors and into the very core of the house. The once solid wood of the walls and floor seemed to twist and pulse with the sound, as though echoing the entity's hatred. They were running out of time. The creature wasn't just angry. It was determined to devour everything. "Lorraine," Ed called out, his voice rough. "We need to find a way to bind it, to stop it here before it can spread." Lorraine's gaze darted to the scattered ritual items around the room. The mirror, though shattered, still gleamed with a faint, ominous glow, fragments of glass reflecting twisted images of the entity moving through different parts of the house, as if it existed in multiple places at once. The symbols on the floor throbbed with a faint, pulsing light, connecting to the mirror like veins, as if feeding its power. Lorraine realized then that the mirror wasn't just a gateway. It was a binding point, the source through which the creature had broken into their world. "We need to destroy the mirror completely," Lorraine whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "It's its anchor." As Ed nodded, he took a step closer to the mirror, but the creature lunged, claws extended. Lorraine acted instinctively, grabbing a shard of the mirror's broken frame and thrusting it forward. The creature shrieked, recoiling as the shard pierced through the misty darkness that formed its body, dissipating into a smoky haze. But even as it recoiled, it circled them again, reconstituting itself in moments, more enraged than ever. Suddenly, they heard pounding on the door. Roger's voice shouted from the other side, desperate. "Ed! Lorraine! What's happening in there? Don't come in!" Lorraine yelled back. "Stay outside, whatever you do." But she could hear the family, their frantic whispers, the sounds of the children sobbing in fear. Every fiber of Lorraine's being wanted to tell them to run, but she knew the house wouldn't let them escape. The entity was now bound to them as much as it was to her and Ed. It had them all trapped, each of them like pieces in its own twisted game. Ed took a deep breath, gripping the cross in one hand and a large, jagged piece of mirror in the other. "If we break the mirror, we may have a chance. We have to sever its connection to this world completely." Lorraine nodded, feeling the weight of the decision, knowing that destroying the mirror could just as easily unleash the creature's full wrath on them. But they had no other choice. She felt the adrenaline rush through her veins, sharpening her senses. With the entity circling them, they had only seconds to act. "Now!" Ed shouted. Together, they struck, shattering the mirror into countless pieces, each shard scattering across the floor like falling stars. The moment the last piece broke, the room exploded in a blinding flash of light. Lorraine felt a surge of energy rush through her. The darkness pulled from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. The entity's anguished wails filled her ears, echoing as it was drawn back through the shattered portal. Its form twisted and flickered, caught between this world and whatever dark abyss it had come from. Just as they thought they had succeeded, the light flickered, dimmed, and then vanished, leaving them in utter blackness. The creature's face reappeared, inches away from Lorraine's own. She could feel the cold of its breath, see the malice in its eyes. With one final, agonizing scream, it lunged for her. She braced herself, expecting to feel its claws tearing into her skin, but instead, she felt something pulling her back, something warm and strong. Ed had wrapped his arms around her, pulling her away from the creature's reach. And then everything stopped. The darkness receded, pulling back into the shattered fragments of the mirror until nothing but silence remained. The room seemed to breathe, the oppressive weight lifting, replaced by an eerie calm. The air was still, and for the first time since they had entered the house, Lorraine felt warmth returning to her body. Slowly, they rose to their feet, their bodies aching from the ordeal. They exchanged a glance, each of them too exhausted to speak, but the relief in their eyes said it all. They had done it. They had broken the entity's hold on the house. When they opened the door, they found Roger and the children huddled together, eyes wide with terror. Roger rushed forward, his voice choked with relief. Is it over?" Ed and Lorraine looked back at the room, at the shattered remains of the mirror, and nodded. "It's over," Lorraine said, her voice barely a whisper. But deep down, a lingering doubt gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the shadows, watching, waiting. Chapter 6. The Descent. The house felt as if it were alive, a breathing, pulsing entity, and its breath was the cold wind that tore through the halls, the whispers that echoed from the walls. Every corner of the farmhouse was suffused with an undeniable presence, a malevolent force that clung to the very air itself, infecting the space with an oppressive darkness. Ed and Lorraine Warren had never faced anything like this before. The horrors they had encountered in their years of paranormal investigation had always been troubling, but this was something far older, far more dangerous. The creature had been born from the very depths of evil, something not just tied to the physical world, but something tied to the very essence of darkness. And now, that darkness had consumed the house, and with it, every part of the Warrens' being. They had thought they were prepared. They had studied every clue, every symbol. They had put together the pieces of the puzzle, but in doing so, they had uncovered something they were not ready for. A curse that stretched back centuries, one that had been buried under layers of bloodshed and suffering. It had started as a simple ritual, a desperate act by someone who had sought power beyond comprehension, and now it had awakened. The cross still burned in Ed's hand, its power flickering in the growing dark as the creature recoiled from its light. But it wasn't enough. No weapon they had was enough. The creature was not bound by the same rules, the same constraints that demons or ghosts obeyed. This was no mere haunting. This was something more. Lorraine could feel it, too. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like it could suffocate them. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, and it was alive. Its walls seemed to shift, its rooms changing, twisting as though the house itself had become a maze, trapping them inside with the force they had unleashed. They couldn't leave. Not yet. The sound of distant footsteps echoed in the hall, growing louder, closer. But it wasn't just the creature. No, there were others, whispers low and guttural, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. The house was filled with souls, victims of the curse, trapped in its grip, their anguish feeding the dark entity that haunted them. Ed and Lorraine didn't have much time. The walls were closing in around them, the air suffocating with the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting for their next move. The family needed to get out, but so did they. There was no safety here, no haven from the darkness. The house was a trap, and unless they acted quickly, they would become just another part of its twisted legacy. Ed, we need to find the source, Lorraine whispered urgently, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The thing that started this. That's the only way we can end this. Ed nodded grimly. They had been through countless cases, had faced demons and ghosts and everything in between, but they had never encountered something so insidious. This was not just a haunting. It was a force, a malevolent intelligence that had been waiting, watching, growing stronger with every passing year. The whispers in the house had grown louder, more frantic. The entities, trapped between the veil of the living and the dead, had sensed them. It was as if the house was coming alive around them, its foundation shifting, its bones creaking with the weight of the power trapped within. Lorraine's eyes scanned the room, her mind racing. She needed to find something, anything, that could give them the key to breaking the curse. There had to be something hidden, something buried deep within the house, a secret that would unravel the twisted web the creature had woven. It had to be somewhere. Suddenly, the floor beneath them groaned. Lorraine's eyes darted to the stairs leading down to the basement. The air was thick with a sour, metallic smell, a stench of blood and rot that seemed to seep from the very ground. The basement, it was where the ritual had begun, where the curse had been born. "It's down there," Ed said quietly, his voice grim. "We have to go down." Lorraine nodded, though a sense of dread washed over her. The basement wasn't just a room in the house. It was the heart of the evil, the place where the darkness had first taken root. But they had no choice. They had to face whatever lay below them, or else the house would consume them all. They descended the stairs slowly, the cold from the basement creeping up their legs like a living thing, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The house seemed to pulse around them, its heartbeat matching the rhythm of their own. At the bottom of the stairs, the air felt heavier, thicker. The basement was even colder than the rest of the house, the shadows in the corners thick like smoke. Lorraine could feel it now. Something ancient, something terrifying, was down here. The creature had been summoned in this place, and now it was feeding off the souls it had trapped, growing stronger with every passing second. The light from their flashlights barely pierced the darkness, illuminating only a small circle in the center of the room. The walls were lined with old shelves, crates, and strange symbols, some faded with time, others newly painted in what appeared to be blood. It was as though the ritual had never truly ended, and the evil had continued to grow, festering in the depths of the house. "We're close," Lorraine said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can feel it." Ed nodded, his jaw clenched. They were close to the source of all this evil, but they were also running out of time. The creature was hunting them, and they had no idea how much longer they could stay hidden. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the basement, snuffing out their flashlights in an instant. The darkness was absolute now, and the silence was deafening. Lorraine reached for Ed's hand, her breath shallow as the tension in the air grew unbearable. Then a sound. A low, guttural growl came from the far side of the room, and Lorraine's heart skipped a beat. The creature was here. It had found them. Ed's voice was steady, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. "We need to finish this now." But as he spoke, the shadows in the room began to shift. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a flicker in the corner of their eyes. But soon, the shadows began to twist and stretch, their movements slow and deliberate, as if the darkness itself were coming to life. Lorraine felt a pressure on her chest, as if the air had thickened to the point where it was hard to breathe. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the creature, but the shadows were everywhere now, shifting, folding in on themselves, and she realized with a chilling certainty that the creature wasn't just one entity. It was the darkness itself, a manifestation of every fear, every torment the house had ever witnessed. Ed took a step forward, his voice low. "We have to destroy the source. The ritual, it's the key." Lorraine nodded. She didn't need to be told. She could feel it, too. There was something here, something buried deep within the walls of the basement. A place where the ritual had been performed. A place where the evil had first been called into being. They had to destroy it, or else they would be trapped in the house forever. But as they moved toward the center of the room, the shadows lunged. They seemed to pulse and writhe thick as oil, enveloping everything in their path. The growl grew louder, more distinct. The creature was closing in. Suddenly, Lorraine was pulled backward, as if something unseen had grabbed hold of her. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, her vision blurred by the shifting shadows. The creature was here. It was real, and it was dragging her into the depths of its hunger. "Lorraine!" Ed shouted, reaching for her, but the shadows were too strong. They were pulling her down into the dark, and for a moment, Lorraine thought she might lose herself in it. The darkness was suffocating, its cold fingers gripping her with the force of a vice. But then a burst of light. Ed's cross flared to life, casting a brilliant beam that sliced through the shadows like a knife. The creature howled in agony, the sound almost human in its desperation. The light pushed it back, but it wasn't enough. It was still there, still watching them, still hungry. With one final effort, Lorraine reached into her pocket and pulled out the talisman they had recovered earlier. The one they had thought was just a symbol, but now knew was the key to ending the curse. She held it high, the light from the talisman burning brighter than anything they had seen before. The shadows recoiled, the creature screeching in fury as the light filled the room, banishing the darkness. But even as the shadows withdrew, Lorraine knew this wasn't over. They had fought back the darkness, but only for a moment. The curse still lingered in the house, and they needed to end it once and for all. The shadows receded but didn't fully disappear. Instead, they lingered at the edges of the room, hissing and writhing like smoke that refused to dissipate. Lorraine's heartbeat thundered in her ears, her eyes fixed on the glowing talisman in her hand. It pulsed with a strange warmth, radiating an energy that seemed to push the darkness back, even if just for a moment. "Lorraine, it's working," Ed said, though his voice was tense. They both knew that the light wouldn't hold the creature at bay forever. It was only a temporary reprieve. They had to act quickly if they wanted to escape the house, or, better yet, end the curse for good. Taking a deep breath, Lorraine looked around the basement, her gaze settling on an old, crumbling altar in the far corner of the room. It was hidden in shadows, but the shape of it was unmistakable. The air around it felt thick and heavy, like it was weighed down by something ancient and terrible. "That's where it started," Lorraine said, nodding towards the altar. "The ritual, it must have happened there." Ed's face was grim as he looked at the altar, his jaw set in determination. "Then that's where we finish it." As they approached the altar, the darkness around them seemed to swell, pressing in with renewed fury. The creature's growl filled the room, low and menacing, vibrating through the walls and floor. It was close, closer than it had ever been, and they could feel its presence surrounding them, an invisible force of hatred and malice. Ed raised the cross in his hand, holding it in front of him like a shield. The light from the talisman flickered, illuminating the grotesque carvings on the altar's surface. Symbols of ancient rituals, words etched in a language long forgotten by time. Bloodstains marred the stone, dried and blackened with age, remnants of sacrifices that had fed the curse for centuries. The creature's growls grew louder, more frantic, as if it sensed what they were about to do. Lorraine's hand shook as she held the talisman, but she forced herself to steady her grip. They had to be strong. They couldn't afford to falter now. Not when they were so close. Together, they began to recite an incantation they had discovered in an old tome, a prayer that was meant to banish darkness, to sever the ties that bound it to the mortal realm. Their voices echoed in the room, weaving together in a powerful, defiant chant that seemed to cut through the air like a blade. The creature screeched, a sound that was almost human in its anguish. The shadows surged forward, crashing against the light like waves against a rocky shore. Ed and Lorraine stood their ground, pouring every ounce of strength they had into the incantation, willing the darkness to retreat, to release its grip on the house and the souls it had trapped within its walls. The light from the talisman grew brighter, illuminating the entire basement with a blinding radiance. The symbols on the altar began to burn, glowing with a fiery intensity as the curse fought back, resisting their efforts to destroy it. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. They pressed on, their voices growing louder, their will unbreakable. And then, with a final deafening scream, the creature was forced back, its presence retreating from the room, shrinking in on itself as the light from the talisman consumed it. The shadows writhed and twisted, clawing at the walls as if they were trying to escape, but there was nowhere for them to go. They were trapped, bound to the curse that had once given them life. The altar cracked, a loud, thunderous sound that echoed through the basement. Pieces of stone crumbled and fell away, revealing a small, hidden compartment beneath the surface. Lorraine reached inside, her hand trembling as she pulled out a small, weathered box. It was covered in dust, its edges worn and frayed with age, but she could feel the power radiating from within it. This must be it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The source of the curse." Ed nodded, his gaze fixed on the box. They both knew what they had to do. With a steady hand, he took the box from Lorraine and placed it on the ground, raising the cross above it. "Together," he said, meeting her gaze. "We'll do this together." They recited the incantation one final time, their voices strong and unwavering. The light from the cross and the talisman merged, forming a brilliant, golden glow that enveloped the box. The creature's final screams echoed in the air, a sound of pure, unfiltered rage, but it was powerless against the light. It could do nothing but watch as the source of its strength was destroyed, its ties to the mortal world severed once and for all. The box shattered, its contents reduced to dust in an instant. The light flared, blinding them both, and then silence. The oppressive darkness lifted, the air clearing as if a heavy weight had been removed from the house. The shadows receded, disappearing into the corners of the room until there was nothing left but a faint, lingering silence. Ed and Lorraine looked around, their breathing heavy, their bodies exhausted. They had done it. They had broken the curse, freed the souls trapped within the house, and banished the creature that had haunted them. But as they made their way back up the stairs, a lingering feeling of unease settled over them. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And as they reached the top of the stairs, Lorraine paused, her gaze fixed on the darkened hallway ahead. The house may have been freed, but some shadows, she knew, would never fully disappear. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The house had become an inescapable nightmare. Its very structure felt like a living organism, breathing and pulsing with dark energy that thrummed beneath the floorboards, through the walls, and into the very air they breathed. Ed and Lorraine Warren were trapped in its twisted grip, the echoes of terror reverberating throughout every inch of the old farmhouse. They had come to banish evil, but what they had unleashed was something far worse than they had ever imagined. The cross Ed held in his hand trembled as the darkness around them seemed to swell and pulse in response. They had thought they were close to ending this nightmare, but the creature was not just a demon or ghost. It was something far more primal, a force of pure, unrelenting malevolence. And it was alive, hunting them with every moment that passed. Lorraine's mind raced as the shadows around them shifted. The basement, where the heart of the evil had begun, had become a battleground. The light from the talisman she held was flickering, its power waning as if it, too, was being drained by the overwhelming presence that surrounded them. They had been wrong to think this was just about the creature. It was a force older than time itself, an entity that had been awakened by the rituals performed in that cursed house. The basement was only the beginning. Now, the evil had spread throughout every corner of the house, and it was pulling them deeper into its grasp. "What are we missing, Ed?" Lorraine's voice was strained, her eyes darting around, searching for something, anything, that could help them. The house seemed to shift before her eyes, the rooms warping, twisting in on themselves like an endless maze that they couldn't escape. "I don't know, Lorraine," Ed replied, his voice tight with frustration. "But we can't keep running. We need to confront whatever this is, or it will consume us all." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their truth. There was no more time for hesitation. They couldn't keep searching for answers in the dark. They had to face whatever lay at the center of this evil and destroy it, or the house would drag them into its depths, where no one would ever find them. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the stench of decay and death. The growls, distant at first, now reverberated through the floors, vibrating the very air around them. The creature was close, closer than ever. Lorraine's hand tightened around the talisman, its warmth fading. The light from it flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. The whispers in the house grew louder, more frantic, as if the spirits trapped within the walls were growing restless. "We have to find the source of this," Lorraine said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the only way to end this." Ed nodded, his gaze scanning the room. The basement had become a labyrinth of shifting shadows, where nothing seemed to stay in place. The creature was no longer a simple entity. It was a presence that pervaded every inch of the house, and it was feeding off their fear, growing stronger with every passing second. "I think I know where it is," Ed said, his eyes narrowing. "The old attic. That's where it all started." Lorraine's heart skipped a beat. The attic. The place where the cursed ritual had first been performed. The place where the evil had been born. It was the one place in the house they had yet to venture, and the one place they had both been dreading. "Let's go," she said, her voice resolute. They had no other choice. The climb to the attic felt like an eternity. The stairs creaked and groaned beneath their feet, and the very air seemed to thicken with each step they took. The house felt like it was shifting around them, its rooms stretching and folding in on themselves, trapping them in its clutches. Every time they turned a corner, the hallways seemed to elongate, as if the house was playing tricks on them, drawing them deeper into its web. They reached the attic door, its wood warped and cracked with age. Lorraine's hand hovered over the handle, her fingers trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew this was it. They were about to face whatever had been unleashed in that cursed house. Ed pushed the door open with a creak, and they stepped into the attic. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood, but something else lingered in the air, a foul, unnatural presence that made their skin crawl. The attic was cramped, cluttered with forgotten relics of the past, old furniture, crates of books, and broken mirrors. But there, in the center of the room, stood a large, cracked mirror. It was covered in layers of dust, but it still gleamed in the dim light from their flashlights. The mirror seemed to pulse, as if something alive were trapped within it, its surface rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. "That's it," Lorraine said, her voice low and filled with dread. "That's where it started." Ed stepped closer to the mirror, his fingers brushing the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. But then the air seemed to shift. A low, guttural growl emanated from the mirror, and the shadows in the attic began to writhe, twisting and turning in unnatural ways. The mirror was not just a reflection. It was a doorway, a portal to whatever evil had been awakened here. And it was reaching out, trying to pull them in. "We need to destroy it," Lorraine said, her voice urgent. "We have to break it, Ed." But before they could act, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around them like 1,000 invisible hands. The air grew colder, and the oppressive darkness seemed to press in from every side. The creature was here, and it was stronger than ever. Ed swung the cross in front of him, its light flaring brightly, but the shadows didn't retreat. Instead, they seemed to grow thicker, more intense. The growls grew louder, more frantic, as if the very house was alive, feeding off the terror that radiated from their bodies. Lorraine felt the grip of the darkness tightening around her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She could feel the evil pressing in from all sides, its malevolent presence growing stronger with every passing second. "Lorraine," Ed gasped, his voice hoarse with fear. "We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The shadows had already consumed them. The world seemed to dissolve around them, and for a moment, they were plunged into total darkness. Lorraine couldn't hear anything. No footsteps, no growls, no whispers. Just a deafening silence that pressed against her ears. She reached out for Ed, but her hand found only emptiness. Then, slowly, a shape began to form in the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting and flickering like a mirage. The air around it crackled with power, and Lorraine could feel its hunger. The hunger of something ancient and primal, a force that had been waiting for this moment. The creature had found them. Ed's voice broke through the silence, frantic and filled with terror. "Lorraine, run!" But there was nowhere to run. The darkness had them in its grip, and the creature was closing in, its eyes burning with a hunger that could never be satisfied. Lorraine tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. The weight of the darkness pressed down on her, as if the very air had turned to lead. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it felt as though the creature's grip was tightening around her soul. In that moment, Lorraine understood. The house wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just cursed. It was a living, breathing entity, a dark force that thrived on fear, on pain, on suffering. And now it had them. Ed's voice came again, more desperate this time. "We have to finish this, Lorraine. We can't let it win." But the creature was already too close, its monstrous form towering over them, its eyes glowing with the promise of eternal torment. The light from the cross flickered, fading as the shadows closed in. And then everything went black. Chapter 8. The Reawakening. The world around them seemed to collapse, an impenetrable void that swallowed them whole. The silence that followed the creature's attack was suffocating, pressing down on them from all sides like an invisible hand. Lorraine's mind raced, trying to grasp at something, anything, that could anchor her in the infinite darkness. There was no escape, no path to follow. She reached for Ed, but her arms met nothing but cold emptiness. Her heart hammered in her chest. Was this the end? The realization settled like a stone in her gut. The house had not simply been haunted. It was alive, a vessel of evil with an insatiable hunger. And now it had them. They were no longer in the realm of the living, nor were they in the grip of the supernatural. They were somewhere else, trapped in a dimension that had no rules, no structure, just an eternal expanse of darkness and terror. Lorraine closed her eyes, desperate to find a shred of light, of hope. But the nothingness around her was too absolute, too overwhelming. She felt herself sinking, pulled downward by an unseen force, her very essence slipping away from her. She gasped, trying to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She was no longer sure if she was even breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the silence broke. A voice. A whisper, distant at first, but growing clearer with every second. "You're not alone." The words echoed through the void, chilling Lorraine to her core. She opened her eyes, searching for the source, but saw nothing. She was still in the darkness, still suspended in an inescapable void. Yet the voice continued. "There's always more." The voice was cold, detached, and human. But it was familiar. Lorraine's pulse quickened as she recognized the tone. It was a voice from her past, one she had heard only in the most terrifying of moments. "Who are you?" Lorraine called out, her voice trembling with fear, desperation. No answer. But the void around her began to shift, slowly at first, and then with an urgency that made her stomach churn. The darkness seemed to ripple, bending and twisting like a living thing. The edges of the void began to blur, as if reality itself were unraveling. She couldn't make sense of it, couldn't comprehend what was happening, but she knew one thing. This was no longer just a house, no longer just a haunting. The very fabric of existence was being torn apart. And then, through the shifting chaos, she saw it. A figure, tall, thin, and impossibly twisted. It emerged from the darkness like a nightmare made flesh, its form flickering in and out of existence. Its face was a grotesque mask, half human, half something else, something ancient, something far older than the house itself. Lorraine's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a demon. This wasn't just a manifestation of evil. This was the source, the heart of the darkness. It was no longer bound by the rules of the physical world. It was free, an entity unshackled by time and space. And it was coming for her. The creature reached out, its elongated fingers brushing against her skin, sending a shock of cold terror through her veins. The moment its touch made contact, Lorraine's entire body spasmed, as if the very essence of her soul were being torn from her. Her mind screamed in agony, but there was no sound, only the deafening silence of the void. The creature was feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every passing second. "Ed!" Lorraine shouted, her voice hoarse with pain, but there was no response. No sign of him. He was lost in this nightmare, just as she was. They had been separated, cast into different corners of this forsaken world. The darkness was too powerful. It had consumed them both. The figure loomed over her, its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, burning with an unnatural hunger. They were deep, empty voids, infinite pits of malice. It was studying her, like a predator circling its prey. "You should never have come," the voice whispered again, this time closer, its presence overwhelming. The words reverberated through Lorraine's mind, striking her like a physical blow. The creature's grip tightened, its fingers digging into her skin, as if it were trying to claw through her very essence. It was no longer just trying to break her physically. It was tearing apart her soul, her spirit, consuming everything that made her who she was. But through the pain, through the darkness, a flicker of resistance ignited within her. Lorraine's mind, though battered and broken, was not so easily destroyed. She had faced unimaginable horrors before, but this was different. This was the core of all evil. It was the thing that had haunted the house, the thing that had corrupted everything it touched. It was alive, but so was she. She took a shallow breath, gathering every ounce of strength within her. She focused, pushing through the overwhelming terror. She couldn't let it win. She couldn't let it claim her. With all the force she could muster, Lorraine reached out, her hand trembling as she summoned the light, the only weapon that had ever been strong enough to combat the darkness. The talisman she had been holding flickered in her hand, its glow dim but persistent, like a tiny candle fighting against a storm. "Begone," she whispered, her voice ragged but firm. "You have no power here." The creature hissed, recoiling from the light, its form distorting and writhing as if in pain. It screeched, an otherworldly sound that reverberated through the very fabric of reality. The darkness trembled, and for a moment Lorraine thought she could see the creature's true form. Something monstrous, impossibly large, its shadow stretching across the entire void. It was a being of pure malice, ancient and vast, and it was not going to let her go easily. The talisman pulsed with a burst of energy, its light flaring brighter than before, a sudden surge of power that sent the creature stumbling back. But even as the light pushed it away, Lorraine knew it wasn't enough. The creature wasn't just a physical being. It was a manifestation of something far older, far more dangerous. It had no weakness, no vulnerability, and yet there was a chance. There had to be. Suddenly, Lorraine's mind cleared. She remembered something Ed had said long ago when they were investigating another dark force. The key to defeating a presence like this wasn't just physical power. It was understanding its nature, its origin. If she could uncover its source, if she could find the root of its strength, maybe, just maybe, she could stop it. The light from the talisman flickered again, and Lorraine's thoughts became focused, sharp. She closed her eyes, drawing on every ounce of willpower she had left. The darkness around her seemed to press in, but she pushed it away. She reached into the depths of her mind, searching, digging for that elusive answer. And then, like a crack in the veil of reality, she saw it. A vision. A flash. The old farmhouse, the place where it all began. But this time, she saw something different. Something she hadn't noticed before. A door, hidden behind a wall of old furniture in the basement, covered in years of dust and cobwebs. A door that led to nowhere. The answer was clear. The door was the key. The creature's grip tightened again, but Lorraine gritted her teeth, fighting against its pull. Ed, she whispered, the name a prayer, a plea. She had to get back to the house. They had to find the door, find the source. The darkness hissed again, the creature's form now fully materialized before her, its eyes burning with rage. But Lorraine wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had found the answer, and she was going to fight with everything she had. The creature lunged at her, its form morphing and twisting in unnatural ways as it attempted to overpower her once more. But Lorraine clung to the vision she had seen, focusing all her energy on it. The image of that hidden door in the basement lingered in her mind, a glimmer of hope in the oppressive darkness. If she could just reach Ed, if she could get back to that basement, they might have a chance of ending this nightmare. With every ounce of strength, Lorraine held the talisman high, its light radiating outward in a desperate surge. The creature reeled back, momentarily disoriented by the brightness. Lorraine took the opportunity to will herself forward, pushing against the darkness that wrapped around her. Each step felt like moving through thick, freezing water, but she forced herself onward, step by agonizing step. Then, through the void, she heard it, a faint voice calling her name. Ed's voice. Lorraine! His voice cut through the darkness, strong and clear, like a lifeline drawing her back to reality. She focused on it, letting the sound guide her. With a final burst of strength, she felt the ground beneath her shift, the cold void giving way to solid floorboards. The shadows lifted, and suddenly she was back, gasping for air in the dim, flickering light of the basement. Ed was there, standing beside her, his face etched with worry and fear. He reached out, steadying her as she stumbled. The darkness still clung to her, lingering like a cold residue, but the sight of Ed's face brought her a rush of relief. They were together again, and they had a plan. We have to find the door, she managed, her voice hoarse. What door? Ed's brow furrowed, but his eyes held a spark of understanding. He could see the urgency in her gaze. There's a hidden door in this basement, Ed. It's the source, the thing that binds the creature here. Lorraine's words were breathless, desperate. We have to destroy it. It's the only way. Ed didn't hesitate. He nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. Then let's find it. They moved quickly, scouring the basement for any sign of the hidden entrance Lorraine had seen in her vision. The dim light cast long, eerie shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with the unmistakable sense of being watched by unseen eyes. But Lorraine pushed the fear aside, focusing solely on the image of the door in her mind. At last, behind a stack of old crates and broken furniture, they found it. A small, unmarked door, almost invisible against the wall. Its wood was warped and cracked with age, as if it hadn't been opened in decades. A cold chill emanated from it, seeping into the air around them. This is it, Lorraine whispered, her hand hovering over the handle. She could feel the darkness radiating from beyond the door, a thick, malevolent energy that made her skin crawl. Are you sure? Ed asked, his voice low and tense. She nodded, steeling herself. This is where it all began. Without another word, she opened the door. Inside was a small, dark chamber, its walls lined with strange symbols and markings that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The air inside was thick and suffocating, filled with the unmistakable stench of decay. And in the center of the room, carved into the floor, was a crude symbol, a sigil that seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. Ed's face paled as he took in the sight. This is a binding ritual," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "They summoned it here, Lorraine. They brought this thing into the world and bound it to this place." Lorraine's heart pounded as she realized the truth. This wasn't just any haunting. It was a curse, a blight that had infected the very foundation of the house. The creature had been summoned by a twisted ritual, its essence anchored to this sigil. Destroying it was their only hope of banishing the evil for good. "We have to break it," Lorraine said, her voice trembling but resolute. They moved closer to the symbol, each step bringing with it a surge of fear and dread. The creature was close. They could feel its presence lurking just beyond the edge of reality, watching, waiting. It knew what they were about to do, and it wasn't going to let them succeed without a fight. As Ed raised his cross and Lorraine held the talisman aloft, a sudden gust of icy wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing the light and plunging them into darkness. A low growl rumbled from the shadows, and the air thickened with the creature's malevolent presence. "Lorraine!" Ed's voice was frantic, his grip tightening on her hand. "We need to finish this. Now!" But the darkness was closing in, pressing down on them from all sides. The creature's form began to take shape in the shadows, its twisted, grotesque body writhing as it emerged from the void. Its eyes burned with an unholy light, and its maw opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. Lorraine felt a surge of terror, but she forced herself to focus. She raised the talisman, its faint glow illuminating the sigil on the floor. Summoning every ounce of strength, she began to chant the words of an ancient prayer, her voice steady and clear. The creature howled in agony as the light from the talisman grew brighter, filling the chamber with a blinding radiance. Ed joined in, his voice merging with hers as they continued the incantation. The light intensified, searing the air and causing the symbols on the walls to writhe and burn. The creature recoiled, its body racked with spasms as the binding sigil began to break. With one final cry, Lorraine and Ed completed the ritual, their voices echoing through the chamber. The sigil shattered, and the creature let out a deafening scream as its form was ripped apart, its essence dissolving into the light. For a moment, there was silence. The oppressive darkness lifted, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. Lorraine staggered, exhaustion overwhelming her as she fell into Ed's arms. They were free. The creature was gone, its curse lifted from the house. But as they made their way back up the stairs, Lorraine couldn't shake a nagging feeling, a sense that something still lingered in the shadows. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Just as they reached the top of the stairs, the faintest whisper echoed through the basement, chilling them to the bone. "You can't get rid of me that easily." Chapter 9. The Descent. The darkness swallowed them whole, its grip tightening like a vice around their hearts. Lorraine felt it like a cold shiver racing down her spine, the sensation of something ancient, vast, and insatiable closing in on them from all sides. The very air seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and her breath came in shallow gasps as she struggled to hold on to her strength. But it was growing harder to fight back. The presence around her was becoming overwhelming, as if the very walls of the house were alive, breathing in sync with the entity they had unleashed. Ed's voice echoed in the distance, but it was faint, distant, so far removed from her that it felt like an impossible dream. Her thoughts, already scattered by the horrors they had endured, began to unravel, the edges blurring and folding in on themselves. She wanted to call out to him, but her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to move, but her body felt frozen, paralyzed by the sheer weight of the darkness. Then she felt it, a cold hand brushing against her arm. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a touch that was both alien and terrifying, sending ripples of icy terror through her. She gasped, but before she could react, the darkness pressed in closer, enveloping her in its suffocating embrace. She could still feel the talisman in her hand, its glow faint but steady, a small beacon of light in the overwhelming void. But it wasn't enough. The creature, no, the entity, was too powerful. The light wasn't pushing it back. It wasn't even slowing it down. It was feeding on their fear, drawing strength from their terror, growing stronger with each passing moment. Lorraine's mind screamed for an escape, for some way out of this nightmare, but the house had already become a labyrinth, shifting and twisting. Each hallway and room a trap designed to keep them from finding the answers they needed. She knew deep down that the house itself was part of the evil, that it was more than just a place haunted by ghosts or demons. It was a conduit, a gateway for something far more ancient, far more dangerous. And now, she and Ed were caught in its web. The sensation of the cold hand was gone, but Lorraine could still feel its lingering touch, a presence that clung to her like a shadow. She turned, but the darkness was thick, impenetrable, and all she could hear was the thrum of her own heartbeat. She was alone. She had to be alone, because if she wasn't, she would never escape. But then she felt it again. A tug, gentle at first, like a whisper calling to her from the depths of the house. Her heart clenched in her chest, her fear rising like a tidal wave. The entity wasn't finished with them. It had found a way to separate them, to isolate them, to keep them trapped in its nightmare. "Ed!" Lorraine shouted, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive silence. The air was thick with it, as though the darkness itself were consuming every sound, every movement. It was then that she saw the flicker of light in the distance. At first, it was faint, a single, trembling beam that seemed too fragile to be real. But it grew stronger with each passing second, like a lifeline thrown to her in the middle of a storm. She didn't hesitate. She ran toward it, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible, the darkness chasing her every step of the way. The light was her only hope, the only thing that could guide her back to Ed, back to safety. The oppressive weight of the evil that surrounded her pressed in on her chest, but she pushed through, her heart beating in rhythm with the light ahead of her. The light grew brighter as she approached, until it illuminated a doorway, a door that had not been there before. It was old, weathered, and covered in years of dust and cobwebs, but it was real. The same door she had seen in her vision, the one that held the answers they had been searching for. With trembling hands, Lorraine reached for the doorknob, the cold metal biting into her palm. She hesitated for only a moment, knowing that behind this door lay something that could either save them or destroy them. But there was no choice. She had to open it. There was no other way out. The door creaked open, the sound echoing through the empty hallway like a warning. But Lorraine stepped through anyway, her heart pounding as the darkness behind her seemed to stretch and twist, trying to reach out for her. What she found on the other side was not what she expected. The room was vast, almost endless, its walls lined with old bookshelves filled with dusty tomes and ancient relics. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, but there was something else, a feeling of profound loss, as if this place had been forgotten by time itself. In the center of the room, a large stone altar stood, its surface covered in strange symbols and markings. And there, kneeling at the altar, was Ed. His eyes were closed, his face pale, his body unmoving. Lorraine's heart leapt into her throat. She rushed forward, her footsteps echoing through the room as she approached him. She reached for his shoulder, shaking him gently. "Ed! Ed, wake up!" she cried, her voice trembling with fear. But there was no response. Her mind raced. What had happened to him? Why was he like this? Suddenly, she noticed something strange. The altar, the symbols, the markings, they were all too familiar. It was the same ritual, the same incantations that had been performed in the basement. The house, the creature, it was all connected. But now, it seemed like the house had claimed Ed as its own. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she touched his face. He was cold, unresponsive, but there was still a faint pulse beneath his skin. He was alive, barely, but the darkness had claimed him, and it was trying to pull him further into its grasp. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift around them. The entity was close. It was feeding on their fear, on their pain, and it was using Ed to do it. Lorraine's mind raced. She had to break the hold it had on him. She had to save him before it was too late. But how? Her eyes fell on the altar again, and she noticed something she hadn't seen before, something that wasn't there the last time she looked. A small, glowing stone sat atop the altar, nestled within a bed of intricate symbols. The light from the stone was faint, but it pulsed with a strange energy, as if it were alive. Lorraine knew, without question, that this was the key. This stone could either break the hold the creature had on Ed, or it could seal their fate forever. With trembling hands, Lorraine reached for the stone. The moment her fingers brushed against its surface, a jolt of energy shot through her, sending a shock of pain through her body. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she saw everything that had led them here. The house, the rituals, the creature, it was all connected. And the stone was the anchor. The stone was a piece of the creature's essence, a fragment of its power. It had been placed here to bind them to the house, to ensure that no one would ever leave. But Lorraine wasn't going to let it win. Not this time. With all the strength she could muster, she grasped the stone tightly in her hand, and the world around her seemed to crack open. The shadows recoiled, the very air vibrating with a primal energy that filled her with both terror and determination. She could feel the creature's presence weakening, its hold on Ed fading. But she wasn't alone. A voice echoed through the room, deep, guttural, and filled with rage. "You cannot defeat me." Lorraine turned, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature was here, in full force, its massive form filling the room, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It was more powerful than ever, but Lorraine's resolve was stronger. She held the stone aloft, its glow now blazing brighter than the sun. "This ends now," she whispered. The light from the stone intensified, and the creature howled, its form writhing and contorting as the light burned through the darkness, tearing at its very essence. The house trembled, its walls shaking violently, and Lorraine could feel the creature's grip on her weakening. But the battle was far from over. The creature would not go quietly. The room seemed to collapse in on itself as the creature's form writhed in agony. Lorraine's grip on the stone tightened, and she felt its raw energy surging through her veins, electrifying every nerve. The creature's presence was overpowering. Its darkness, its malice, its sheer weight in the air suffocating her with every breath. The walls of the room twisted like they were alive, distorting in unnatural angles, as if the house itself was reacting to the stone's power. Lorraine's eyes darted around in a desperate search for any way to stop it, but she knew there was no easy solution. The creature was not merely a physical entity. It was a manifestation of fear, of chaos, of pure evil. She could feel its intelligence, its cunning, as it sought to break her resolve. "You cannot banish me," the creature growled, its voice now coming from every direction. It sounded like it was inside her head, its whispers crawling through her thoughts, twisting her memories, using her fear against her. "You're too weak. You're just like all the others. You'll never escape me." Lorraine's pulse quickened, the stone's light flickering in her hand. It was too much for her to hold alone. She needed Ed. She needed him to fight beside her, to break free from whatever dark hold had taken root inside him. But as she looked down at him, his body still slumped at the altar, the faintest trace of a smile crept across his pale lips. It wasn't a smile of comfort. It was twisted, a smile of surrender. "No!" Lorraine cried, stepping toward him, the stone still glowing fiercely in her hand. The air thickened, the shadows closing in on her, pulling her into their grip. She could hear the creature's laughter, dark and mocking, as the room seemed to spin around her. "Ed, you have to wake up. You can fight this." Lorraine's voice cracked as she pleaded with him, her words desperate, but she saw no movement. He was trapped in a nightmare, his body no more than a puppet of the creature's will. The laughter grew louder, drowning out everything else. "He cannot fight me. None of you can." The voice reverberated through the room, twisting in all directions, breaking her focus. "The house has claimed him. And now it will claim you." Lorraine closed her eyes, struggling to stay grounded as the darkness threatened to swallow her whole. She couldn't lose him. Not now. The stone pulsed once more in her palm, its energy fighting against the creature's malevolent force. But it wasn't enough. A guttural shriek echoed through the room, pulling Lorraine's eyes open. The altar, the very foundation of the house, was cracking, fissures spiderwebbing across the stone surface. The shadows swirled faster, converging toward Ed like a tide, attempting to pull him deeper into the altar itself, as if the house was trying to absorb him completely. Lorraine's breath came in sharp gasps. She couldn't let this happen. She had to act. She had to break the connection between Ed and the creature once and for all. There had to be a way to save him. As the shadows reached for Ed, Lorraine lunged forward, hurling herself toward the altar. The stone in her hand flared to life, brighter than it had ever been, sending ripples of light cascading across the room. The entity screamed in fury, its form dissolving into tendrils of black smoke that writhed and snapped like serpents. It was trying to tear the stone from her, but Lorraine held on tighter than ever. "Ed, fight!" she screamed, her voice breaking through the suffocating darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The shadows paused, as though the entity itself was considering her words. Then Ed's body twitched. His eyelids fluttered. "Ed!" Lorraine gasped, her heart racing. His eyes opened, but they were not the familiar brown she had known for years. They were empty, black, soulless voids. The creature had taken hold of him completely. "No!" Lorraine cried, stepping back. The shadows thickened around him, twisting in his form, as though the very air was being sucked into his body. But Ed's lips parted, and a voice, not his, came forth. "You can't save him, Lorraine. You cannot save him from me." The creature's voice was different this time. It was more personal, more taunting, as though it had found something it could use against her. Lorraine's heart clenched in terror, but she forced herself to step forward again, the stone still glowing like a beacon of hope. She shook her head. "No, I won't let you have him. I won't let you take him, not after everything we've been through." Her hand shook as she reached toward Ed. "You're stronger than this, Ed." "I know you are." The shadows around Ed twisted, pulling him down into the altar's stone like a drowning man sinking beneath the waves. His body jerked and spasmed as the creature fought for control. Lorraine's chest tightened. She could feel it now, the crushing weight of despair, the desperation threatening to overwhelm her. The room seemed to pulse, the walls closing in around them as the creature's power rose. But then, the stone flared brighter than ever before. A pulse of white light erupted from Lorraine's hand, sending a shockwave through the room, cracking the floor beneath them. The shadows screamed, recoiling, retreating from the light's fury. The presence of the creature faltered for a moment, as if it were uncertain, as if it feared what was coming next. "Please, Ed," Lorraine whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Come back to me." For the briefest of moments, Ed's eyes, the real Ed's eyes, flashed. His hand trembled, and the faintest hint of recognition crossed his features. He gasped for air, his chest heaving. Lorraine seized the moment. She rushed forward, clutching the stone and placing it against his chest. The light from the stone flooded his body, casting out the darkness, burning it away with relentless intensity. The creature shrieked, its form unraveling, dissipating into the ether as the light overwhelmed it. The room quaked, the very foundation of the house trembling under the force of the battle. But Lorraine held firm, the stone pulsing with the last of its power, fighting back the evil that had nearly consumed them. And then, as quickly as it had started, the light began to fade. The stone's glow softened, its warmth spreading through Ed's body. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, his features softening as the malevolent presence inside him was expelled. The altar, which had once seemed so imposing, now seemed nothing more than a crumbled relic. Lorraine knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. He was alive. He was safe. But as she held him in her arms, she knew this wasn't over. The creature was still out there, somewhere. The house still held its secrets. The evil had been banished for now, but Lorraine couldn't shake the feeling that it would return. As she looked down at Ed, the man she loved, now free from the creature's grip, she knew that this would never truly end. Not until the house was destroyed. Not until the darkness was gone. Chapter 10. The Final Reckoning. The morning light bled through the broken windows, casting a faint glow over the remnants of the house. But the peace that followed their battle felt fragile, like a dream that could shatter at any moment. Lorraine stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon, but her mind was far from the quiet beauty outside. She could still hear the echoes of the entity's whispers in the back of her mind, like a voice lingering just beyond her reach. Ed was sitting at the edge of the bed, his face pale, but no longer marked by the hollow, dark eyes of the creature that had taken hold of him. The stone's power had freed him, but the damage had already been done. The battle was over, but it had left scars, on them both, on the house, and on everything they had known. "We did it, Lorraine," Ed said quietly, his voice raw but steady. He hadn't said much since waking up, the weight of the experience pressing heavily on him. "We stopped it." Lorraine didn't turn to face him. "I don't know if it's really gone, Ed. The house, the entity, it's still here. It's still waiting." Ed stood and walked toward her, placing a hand on her shoulder. His touch was warm, comforting, and despite everything they had been through, he had a way of grounding her. The storm inside her mind hadn't quieted, but his presence made her feel like she could stand against it. "We can leave. We've done what we came for." But Lorraine shook her head, her eyes never leaving the view outside. The house seemed to breathe around them, the quiet of the morning unnatural in its stillness. There was something about the air here, the lingering sense that the battle hadn't truly ended. She could feel the weight of their decisions, the weight of their survival, but she also knew that evil, in its purest form, wasn't so easily destroyed. It waited, and it had been here far too long to simply fade away. "Leaving isn't enough," she said, her voice firm, though the words felt hollow. "This house, this place, it's tied to the creature, to everything that happened here. We need to destroy it, once and for all. Ed's face darkened. He glanced around the room, and Lorraine could see his mind racing, processing the same thoughts that had been swirling in hers. The destruction of the entity hadn't brought peace. It had only opened a new door. The house was still standing, and the darkness was still clinging to every corner. It's dangerous, Ed said, his voice low. We've already done so much, Lorraine. Maybe it's time to just walk away. But Lorraine knew that wasn't an option. They couldn't leave until the house was truly empty, until the entity's grip on the world, on their lives, was severed. The only way to do that was to destroy the house completely, to burn away the evil that had festered here for so long. I can't live knowing it's still out there, she replied, turning to face him. Her eyes were steady, but inside, there was a fire that hadn't been there before. The creature had almost claimed them both, and that was a debt that needed to be paid. We finish this, Ed. We take it down once and for all. Ed hesitated, his gaze falling to the floor, but when he looked up, his eyes were filled with the same resolve. Then we do it together. The air in the house felt heavier now, the silence deeper. As they moved through the empty halls, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, seemed to whisper warnings. But neither of them stopped. They had come this far. They had faced the terror, and now it was time to confront the very heart of it. The stairs creaked beneath their feet as they ascended to the second floor, where the house had seemed to come alive, where the creature's grip had been the strongest. The door to the room where it had all started stood before them, as if waiting. I thought we sealed this room, Ed muttered, glancing at Lorraine. Why is it still here? Lorraine's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, her hand resting on the cold handle. Because it's not done yet, she said quietly. The house is a part of it. We need to destroy the heart of it, and this room is where it began. Without waiting, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was just as they had left it, the altar at the center, the walls covered in cryptic symbols. But there was something different about it now. The air felt thick with the remnants of the dark ritual, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than before, as if they were alive, reaching for them. This is it, Lorraine said, her voice steady but laced with tension. We need to burn it all. Ed nodded. I'll get the fuel. As he turned to leave the room, Lorraine moved toward the altar, her eyes scanning the symbols on the walls, the ancient carvings that had once held the creature's power. She could still feel the echoes of its presence here, deep, ancient, almost sentient. But it was weak. She could feel that too. They had taken its strength, its essence, when they had used the stone. But the house had been its anchor, its home, and it was far from defeated. Her eyes landed on the altar. It had once been a place of power, a site where dark rituals were performed to summon forces far beyond human comprehension. The creature had been bound to it, made to serve the will of whoever had controlled the house. But the creature had outgrown its bounds. It had taken control. Lorraine's fingers brushed the edge of the altar, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. She had to destroy it, destroy everything that connected the house to the dark force that had ravaged their lives. As she looked back to the doorway, she saw Ed standing there, a canister of gasoline in his hands. The look on his face was one of determination. They had to burn it all. Ready? Ed asked, his voice calm but laced with something else, something darker. It wasn't fear. It was resolve. Lorraine didn't answer right away. She just nodded. Together, they moved toward the altar, and with a steady hand, Lorraine poured the gasoline over the stone surface. The smell of the fuel filled the room, mixing with the stale air of the house. The shadows seemed to recoil, and Lorraine felt a strange sense of victory. But she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. She pulled a match from her pocket and struck it, the spark catching in the air, before she held it to the gasoline-soaked altar. The flames erupted, licking at the air like hungry tongues, consuming the stone and spreading across the room. The house seemed to groan under the force of the fire, the very walls shaking as the flames began to burn away everything. The symbols, the relics, the remnants of the dark past. But just as Lorraine began to feel a sense of relief, the air shifted again. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and a deafening roar filled the room, as if the house itself was protesting. Lorraine stumbled back, clutching onto Ed for balance. It's not done, Ed shouted, his voice urgent. It's still fighting. The walls seemed to pulse with life as the fire spread, and Lorraine realized in that moment that the house was more than just a home. It was a vessel, a prison for something far more ancient and far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. And it wasn't going to go down without a fight. The fire raged, but it was not enough. The entity, the house itself, was fighting back, tearing at the very fabric of reality. The flames weren't enough to destroy the evil, and the house wasn't ready to let them leave. The room was alive with fire, but it felt as though the flames were being consumed by the house itself. The walls groaned under the pressure, the floor trembling as if the very foundation of the place was trying to resist the destruction. Lorraine felt the oppressive force building, an overwhelming sense of dread closing in around her. The heat of the flames only seemed to fuel the dark power in the air, making it thicker, more suffocating. Ed grabbed her by the arm, his grip firm but trembling with the strain of the moment. "We have to get out of here, Lorraine," he shouted above the roar of the fire. His voice was raw, desperate. "The house won't burn. It's too strong." But Lorraine stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the altar. The flames flickered and twisted around it, but they didn't seem to be consuming it. The stone, once a symbol of power, now felt like a scar in the very heart of the house, a scar that refused to heal. The house was fighting them, trying to preserve its secrets, trying to keep its grip on the world outside. "No," Lorraine said, shaking her head. "We finish this. We burn it all." But even as she spoke, she felt the room shift again. The air thickened, becoming oppressive as a deep rumble echoed through the house. It was as if the ground itself was trembling in fury, reacting to the threat of its destruction. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, darker, more pronounced. The door slammed shut with a deafening crack, trapping them inside. Lorraine spun toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's locking us in," she muttered under her breath. "The house is trying to trap us." Ed moved quickly to the door, his fists pounding against the wood, but it wouldn't budge. The walls were closing in around them, the space narrowing with every passing second. The fire was roaring, but it was being drowned out by the unnatural sounds of the house, creaking, groaning, like the bones of an ancient beast awakening. "We're not going to make it out if we don't do something," Ed said, panic creeping into his voice. Lorraine didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were locked on the altar, on the stone that had once held so much power. It wasn't just a relic. It wasn't just a symbol of evil. It was the heart of the house itself. And the only way to destroy the evil within these walls was to destroy its heart. The fire was fighting against the house, but it wasn't enough. The stone was not burning. It was like it was absorbing the flames, twisting the energy into something darker, something more powerful. Lorraine reached into her pocket and pulled out the stone, the very same stone that had given them the strength to fight the creature. She could feel its energy pulsing in her hand, steady, unyielding. It wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon. And right now, it was the only thing that could end this. "Ed, get away from the door," Lorraine shouted. He hesitated, looking at her with confusion in his eyes. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to end it," she said, her voice tight with determination. "But I need you to trust me." Without waiting for his response, Lorraine held the stone high above her head and let out a primal cry. The moment the stone's energy collided with the air, the ground shook violently beneath their feet. The room exploded with light, the fire doubling in intensity, the shadows retreating in fear. The stone was amplifying the flames, channeling them into a force that pushed against the very fabric of the house. The altar cracked with a deafening noise, its ancient stone splitting in two. The shadows recoiled as if struck by a hammer, and Lorraine felt the air snap with a sharpness she couldn't explain. And then everything went still. For a moment, the fire stopped, the rumbling ceased. The house was silent. The stone had shattered, its power used to its full extent, and the creature's grip on the house had been severed. The walls stopped shaking, and the oppressive air lifted. Lorraine lowered the stone in her hand, her body shaking with exhaustion. But there was no more dark force pressing against her. The door behind them creaked, then slowly swung open. The house had relinquished its hold. Lorraine looked over at Ed, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We did it," she whispered, but the words felt hollow. There was no victory in the air, no sense of triumph. Just the emptiness of a battle that had taken everything from them. Ed's eyes met hers, and for the first time since the chaos had begun, he smiled, a weary, exhausted smile, but one full of gratitude and relief. He stepped toward her, his hand gently cupping her face, as if to reassure himself that she was still there, still real. The light from the flames still danced in his eyes, but it was different now. It wasn't fear. It was the light of survival. "We're free," he said softly, but the weight of the past hung heavy between them. But Lorraine knew it wasn't truly over. The entity, the house, had been banished, but its legacy would remain. There were places in the world where darkness could never truly be defeated, where evil would always find a way to return. She had seen it in the house, had felt it in the stone, in the air around her. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. But for now, the house was silent. The fire had burned out. The shadows had retreated. As they walked out of the room, the destruction of the altar marking the end of their journey, they heard the faintest whisper in the distance. Not from the house, but from the world outside. It was a promise, an echo, of things to come. Lorraine didn't turn back. She didn't need to. The house had been destroyed, but its legacy would linger in their memories. And as they stepped outside into the cold morning air, she knew they had survived the worst of it. They had faced the darkness and come out on the other side. But she couldn't ignore the feeling that the fight, in some form, was still ahead of them. Together, they would face it. Together, they would always face it. And as the sun rose over the smoldering remnants of the house, Lorraine finally allowed herself to breathe. Thank you for daring to listen to the stories that linger, in the places where the light does not reach. The darkness calls, and you've answered. But beware, for once you've heard the whispers, they have a way of following you. The chill you feel creeping up your spine? It's not just the cold air. It's the spirits of the past, the restless souls, waiting for their stories to be heard. And now they know you. You're a part of their tale. If you dare, let the darkness know you're not afraid. Share, with others who wander too far into the unknown. But remember, once shared, the spirits may come for them too. Subscribe to this haunted journey, for the whispers never stop, and we will always return to tell you more. So, if you're brave enough, stay with us, and let the shadows guide you deeper into the stories that live, breathe, and haunt.